The advanced calculus equation had been on the board for 3 days. None of the AP students could solve it, none of the teachers wanted to admit they were stuck, and the substitute had simply worked around it. But when Emma arrived early Tuesday morning, she found it solved in perfect handwriting, and the only person in the building was the janitor. Welcome to Vaulted Secret Stories. Before we begin this incredible tale of hidden genius, lost recognition, and the moment when a student discovered that greatness sometimes hides behind a mop and bucket, tell me in the comments, have you ever encountered someone whose intelligence completely surprised you? And if you believe stories of unrecognized brilliance deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. This story will show you that sometimes the most brilliant minds are found in the most unexpected places. Carlos Rodriguez had been the night janitor at Lincoln High School for 15 years. He arrived every evening at 6 p.m. sharp, just as the last teachers were gathering their things. By 6:30, the building was his domain, empty hallways that echoed with his cartwheels, classrooms filled only with the soft swish of his mop. At 62, Carlos was a small man with graying hair and clothes that were always clean but never new. His uniform bore the school district logo and his name Carlos Rodriguez Custodial Services. What the embroidered name didn't say was that Carlos spoke 7 languages fluently. It didn't mention that he held 3 doctoral degrees. And it certainly didn't indicate that he had once stood on a stage in Stockholm, accepting one of the most prestigious awards in science. The students knew him only as the quiet man who emptied their trash. They called him Silent Carlos because he rarely spoke except to nod hello or politely asked them to move their feet so he could mop. The teachers treated him with distant courtesy, important enough to acknowledge, not important enough to really see. They knew he did good work because the school was always spotless. But beyond that, Carlos Rodriguez was simply part of the building's infrastructure. What none of them realized was that Carlos Rodriguez was not his real name. His birth name was Dr. Carlos Miguel Santos-Rodriguez, and 25 years earlier, he had been one of the most celebrated biochemists in the world. From 1975 to 1998, Dr. Santos-Rodriguez had led a research team at Stanford University that revolutionized cancer treatment. His work on cellular regeneration had produced 3 major breakthroughs that saved hundreds of thousands of lives. He had published over 200 papers and collaborated with the brightest scientific minds of his generation. In 1987, at 37, he had received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for discovering a protein synthesis process that allowed damaged cells to repair themselves. The research had taken 12 years and resulted in treatments that turned death sentences into manageable conditions. But in 1999, everything changed. A calculation error in one of his lab reports, a single transposed number, led to complications in a clinical trial. 17 patients experienced severe side effects, and 3 died. The error was caught within weeks, but the damage was done. Dr. Santos-Rodriguez's reputation was destroyed, his funding revoked, his position terminated. The scientific community that had once celebrated him now treated him as a cautionary tale. Colleagues avoided his calls. Journals rejected his submissions. Within 6 months, one of the world's most promising researchers had become unemployable. Carlos spent 2 years trying to rebuild his career, but the scandal followed him everywhere. By 2001, with his savings exhausted and his wife having left him, Carlos made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He legally changed his name and applied for a custodial position at Lincoln High School. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same hands that had once manipulated molecules to save lives now pushed mops across floors. The same mind that had solved problems at the cellular level now figured out efficient cleaning routines. For 15 years, Carlos had maintained his invisible routine. He had perfected the art of being unnoticed, cleaning around students and teachers without drawing attention to himself. But Carlos had one weakness. He couldn't resist solving problems. When he cleaned science classrooms, he would see equations on whiteboards that had been left incomplete. Sometimes they were homework problems, sometimes teacher examples, sometimes challenges that had stumped everyone. Carlos would tell himself to ignore them, but his mind had been trained for 40 years to see patterns and solve puzzles. Walking away from an unsolved equation felt like leaving a fire burning. So occasionally, very carefully, Carlos would solve them. He would wait until the building was empty, check that no cameras could see, then quietly complete whatever mathematical challenge had been abandoned. He always wrote in handwriting different from his natural script, never showing his work completely. In 15 years, he had done this perhaps 30 times. Never anything to advance that would make people ask questions about who could have solved it. But on Tuesday morning in November, when 17-year-old Emma Chen arrived early to work in the library, she decided to check her AP Calculus classroom first, to look at the equation that had been frustrating her class for 3 days. What she found there would change both of their lives forever. Emma Chen was the kind of student who thrived on challenges. As a senior at Lincoln High, she carried a 4.0 GPA, served as president of both the math club and academic decathlon team, and had been accepted early admission to MIT. The equation on Mr. Patterson's whiteboard had been driving her crazy since Friday. It wasn't regular coursework, a challenge problem from a mathematics conference that he'd offered extra credit for solving. After 3 days of attempts by the school's brightest seniors, the board still showed only failed attempts. When Emma unlocked room 237 and flipped on the lights, she stopped dead. The equation was solved. Not just solved elegantly, beautifully, perfectly solved. The work was written in handwriting she didn't recognize, with each step clearly shown. Whoever had done this hadn't just found the answer. They had found the most efficient path, using techniques from advanced textbooks she'd only browsed. Emma studied the solution with growing amazement. This wasn't student work. This was someone with serious mathematical training who understood calculus far beyond high school level. But who could have done it? The janitor's cart was visible through the window. Emma could see Carlos Rodriguez methodically mopping near the main office, the same routine she'd observed for 4 years. On impulse, she approached him. "Excuse me, Mr. Rodriguez?" Carlos looked up, surprised. Few students ever addressed him directly. "When you were cleaning last night, did you see anyone working on the math problem in room 237? Carlos glanced toward the classroom, and Emma caught something in his expression. Nervousness? Or recognition? "No, miss. Building was empty when I cleaned that room. Someone solved this equation overnight, and I'm trying to figure out who." Carlos looked at the board again, and Emma watched his face carefully. She saw his eyes track across the solution with quick, automatic understanding. The way she looked at basic algebra problems. "Maybe one of the teachers came back after I finished cleaning," Carlos said carefully. That afternoon, Emma made a decision. She went to the main office and asked to see personnel files for the custodial staff. Claiming she was writing a school newspaper article, the file for Carlos Rodriguez was remarkably sparse. Previous employment at various institutions without specifics, no educational background beyond high school. But there was something odd. On the back of his application, someone had written chemical formulas that had been crossed out but were still partially visible. Emma researched these formulas and found something that made her heart race. They were citations from scientific papers published in the 1980s and 1990s, authored by Dr. Carlos Miguel Santos-Rodriguez, who had won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1987. When she looked up the photo accompanying the articles, her breath caught. The man in the picture was younger, in a suit, standing next to laboratory equipment, but the face was unmistakable. It was Carlos Rodriguez, the janitor. Emma spent the week researching Dr. Santos-Rodriguez's fall from grace. She learned about the laboratory accident that had ended his career, the brilliant scientist whose single mistake had cost lives and destroyed his reputation. She began observing Carlos during his cleaning routine, staying late ostensibly for college applications. What she saw was remarkable. Carlos moved through science classrooms with familiarity beyond janitorial duties. He would pause at student experiments, mentally analyzing setups, occasionally adjusting equipment to prevent failures. Finally, Emma made her decision. She waited until the building was nearly empty, then positioned herself outside the chemistry lab, where Carlos would be cleaning. "Dr. Santos-Rodriguez," she said quietly when he emerged. Carlos froze. For 15 years, no one had called him by that name. "I think you have me confused with someone else. Miss, I know about the Nobel Prize. I know about Stanford. I know about what happened in 1999. Carlos was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want?" "I want to understand why one of the most brilliant scientists in the world is mopping floors at my high school." Carlos sighed deeply. "May I ask how you figured it out?" Emma explained about the solved equation, her research, the chemical formulas on his application. "You're very observant," Carlos said, "and very persistent. Why are you here? Why haven't you tried to rebuild your career?" Carlos was quiet for so long, Emma wondered if he would answer. "I killed 3 people, he said simply. "A calculation error that I should have caught. 3 people died because I made a mistake, but it was an accident. I was the principal investigator. I was responsible for every calculation, every protocol, every safety measure. 3 people trusted my work with their lives, and my work killed them. So you gave up everything. I lost the right to it. When you make a mistake that costs lives, you don't get to continue as if nothing changed." Emma felt tears forming. "But you could have helped so many more people. How many lives could you have saved if you'd kept working? And how many might I have killed with the next mistake? When you've been responsible for deaths, you don't get to gamble with other lives anymore." They stood quietly. Finally, Emma asked, "Don't you miss it? The research, the discovery?" Carlos smiled sadly. "Every day. But missing something doesn't mean you deserve to have it back. What if you could help without taking responsibility for lives? What if you could teach? Who would want to learn from someone who made such a catastrophic error?" Emma looked at him directly. "I would." Carlos was startled. "I'm going to MIT to study biochemistry. I want to do cancer research. I could learn more from you in one conversation than from a semester of classes." "Emma, you solved that calculus problem in minutes. You correct experiments without touching them. You have knowledge that could help students learn. Help the next generation avoid the mistakes you made." Carlos shook his head. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because if I start teaching again, I might start to think I deserve forgiveness for what I did, and I don't." Emma stared at him. "Dr. Santos-Rodriguez, that's the most selfish thing I've ever heard." Carlos looked shocked. "Selfish? You're so focused on your guilt that you're ignoring students who could benefit from your knowledge. You're denying us the chance to learn from one of the most brilliant scientists alive because you've decided your suffering is more important than our education." The words hit Carlos like a physical blow. "You think I'm being selfish by trying to prevent more harm? I think you're being selfish by assuming your guilt is more significant than the good you could do. You made a terrible mistake, and people died. But hiding in shame doesn't honor their memory. Using what you learned to help others, that might." Carlos stood looking at this 17-year-old who had just challenged everything he'd believed for 15 years. "What are you suggesting? Maybe it's time to stop punishing yourself and start helping others." Emma's words haunted Carlos for weeks. For the first time in 15 years, he began questioning whether his self-imposed exile was the right choice. He started paying closer attention to classes around him, listening to students struggle with concepts that seemed fundamental to him. In each case, he found himself wanting to help. One evening in December, Carlos made a terrifying decision. He knocked on Emma's classroom door where she was working on college applications. "Miss Chen, may I see what you're working on?" Emma looked up from her laptop where she'd been struggling with a paper about protein synthesis. "It's a research proposal for MIT. I'm trying to design a study about cellular regeneration, but I'm way out of my depth." Carlos approached slowly. "May I look?" Emma turned her laptop toward him. Carlos read for several minutes, his expression growing animated. "This is good, very good. But you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be." "What do you mean?" Carlos pulled a chair next to her desk. "You're trying to track individual protein markers, which is accurate but incredibly labor-intensive. What if you measured the aggregate effect on cellular metabolism instead?" Carlos began sketching on scratch paper, explaining how to measure cellular energy consumption through spectrophotometry. Emma felt like she was glimpsing a completely different level of scientific thinking. "Dr. Santos-Rodriguez, would you help me rewrite this proposal? If I help you, it has to be our secret. I can't have people knowing who I really am." "Why not?" "Because if administration finds out they've been employing a disgraced scientist under false pretenses, I'll lose my job. This job is the only stability I've had in 15 years. They worked together for 2 hours, Carlos guiding Emma through advanced biochemistry, while she translated his insights. By the time they finished, Emma's proposal had been transformed from a competent high school project into something publishable. "This is incredible," Emma said. "I understand cellular regeneration better after 2 hours with you than after a semester of AP Bio." Carlos felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. The satisfaction of teaching, of watching, understanding expand because of knowledge he'd shared. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Carlos spent the rest of the school year quietly mentoring Emma and gradually a small group of other students sworn to secrecy. By spring, Carlos had become secret mentor to 12 students, all showing remarkable improvement in scientific understanding. Emma had been accepted to MIT with a full scholarship. Her research proposal, refined with Carlos's guidance, impressed the admissions committee so much they offered her a graduate research position. But as graduation approached, Emma realized she couldn't leave without acknowledging what Carlos had done. On the night before graduation, Emma and 11 other students gathered in the chemistry lab. When Carlos entered, he found them standing around a table with a hand-painted banner. "Thank you, Dr. Carlos Miguel Santos-Rodriguez, for teaching us that brilliance means nothing without compassion, that knowledge is worthless without wisdom, and that the greatest discoveries come from learning from our mistakes." Next to it was a plaque reading, "Nobel Prize in Chemistry, 1987, Nobel Prize in Teaching, every day after." Carlos stood overwhelmed. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "Yes, we did," Emma replied. "You taught us that great scientists aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who learn from their mistakes and use that knowledge to help others." One by one, the students told Carlos how his mentoring had changed their academic trajectories and understanding of science. "But more than that," Emma said, "you taught us about responsibility, about how knowledge comes with obligation, about how the greatest honor isn't receiving recognition for discoveries, but using discoveries to help others discover things too." Carlos was crying now. These young people had somehow given him back what he thought he'd lost forever, the sense that his knowledge could still matter. That night, Carlos called his sister in San Diego. "Maria, it's Carlos. I think I might be ready to stop hiding." 2 years later, Dr. Carlos Miguel Santos-Rodriguez stood before a classroom at San Diego Community College, teaching Introduction to Biochemistry to students who knew exactly who he was and what he had done. He had been hired, not despite his past, but because of it. The administration valued his combination of world-class expertise and hard-earned wisdom about scientific responsibility. On the first day of each semester, Carlos would tell students about his Nobel Prize and his mistake. He would explain how one error had cost lives and taught him lessons no textbook could convey. He would talk about 15 years of hiding and about students who taught him that hiding from mistakes was less valuable than learning from them. His classes were among the most popular on campus. Students appreciated his extraordinary knowledge, his humility, and his constant reminders about the human cost of scientific error. Emma Chen, now a junior at MIT, visited every winter break. She was conducting research in cellular regeneration, following a path that built on Carlos's original work while incorporating safety protocols. His experience had taught him to emphasize. The Nobel Prize that had spent 15 years hidden in a closet now sat on Carlos's desk at the community college, next to photos of his students and a sign reading, "The greatest discovery is learning that knowledge without wisdom is worthless, but wisdom without sharing is selfish." Carlos had learned that redemption wasn't about forgetting past mistakes or earning forgiveness. It was about using those mistakes to become a better teacher, a more careful scientist, and a more thoughtful human being. Every morning when he entered his classroom, Carlos thought about the 3 patients who had died because of his error. He carried their memory not as a burden that paralyzed him, but as a responsibility that motivated him to train the next generation to be more careful, more thorough, and more aware of the lives that hung in the balance. The janitor who had once hidden behind a mop and bucket had become Dr. Santos-Rodriguez again, not by forgetting his past mistakes, but by transforming them into lessons that could help others avoid repeating them. In his office, Carlos kept a letter from Emma written during her first year at MIT. "You taught me that the greatest scientists aren't the ones who never fail, they're the ones who fail, learn, and then teach others how to succeed. Some secrets are meant to be kept, others are meant to be shared." Carlos had spent 15 years learning the difference. The advanced calculus equation was solved, but the most important problem, how to transform shame into purpose, knowledge into wisdom, and mistakes into teaching moments. That equation Carlos was still working on, one student at a time. Welcome to Vaulted Secret Stories, where we remember that brilliance isn't about never making mistakes, it's about what you do after you make them.